Ignatius laughed nervously. Was it my imagination, he asked himself. He had little time to ponder the question. His lordship had sent notice that he would like to take his guests on a guided tour of his gardens and glass. Ignatius was to spruce himself up and be at hand if required to answer any of his guests' questions. The proper work of the day had to be sidelined, as under-gardeners were not to be seen in the garden. It was a bright day, and there was plenty of work that had now been thrown out of schedule. After his lordship had left with his guests, Ignatius had a deuce of a time catching up with that day's jobs. It was already after sunset as Ignatius ran round the glasshouses, locking up and casting an eye over things. He simply barged into the stove-house to check it. He dropped his keys in horror. The swollen bud of leaves had once again unfurled, and again there was human hand growing from the pot. However, this time it seemed to thrash around at the wrist and twitch its fingers. He didn't run away, but seemed quite fixed to the spot. Ignatius knew he was terrified of what he saw, but equally he was astonished. Slowly he stepped closer to the thrashing hand. It seemed to notice, and the hand stopped moving quite so violently. "I am Ignatius Crump, head keeper of glass. I have grown you," Ignatius suddenly spouted, gaining more bravery in himself. The hand gave a gracious swirl, as if it were acknowledging the introduction from Ignatius. Then, with a deep breath, Ignatius leant over and gently lifted the plant up to examine it. He held it at arm's length, quite worried in case the hand tried to grab him. It was getting quite dark outside, and Ignatius felt inclined to turn and leave. He noticed the manner in which the hand held its fingers, and was moving. What was it doing? "Goodness," Ignatius exclaimed, "you are trying to write!" The hand gave the same gracious swirl. In a flash, Ignatius darted to the potting shed and gathered up some writing paper and a sharp pencil. He returned with them to the stove-house. He placed the sheets of paper in reach of the plant and carefully gave the hand the pencil. Immediately, the hand began to scribble in the sheets. Occasionally it stopped and tapped the pencil on the bench. Ignatius took a gas lamp over to the plant. "What are these marks?" he asked, and craned to study the writing. "Why, that looks like music." Ignatius stood back from the plant. He was quite excited, but equally he felt fearful of the abominable thrashing hand plant. He stepped back from the stove-house. He resolved to return first thing in the morning and examine the plant in plain daylight. The next day, Ignatius was first to be about in the walled garden. As usual, he unlocked the glasshouses. He left the stove-house till last, so as to examine his bizarre plant. There again the hand was furled back within its tight casing of bright green leaves. However, lying all around were sheets of paper that had music written on them. "Ignatius Crump!" The voice made Ignatius leap up. He spilled the sheets he'd just gathered. "Why, your lordship! Forgive me, I got a start." His lordship had risen early. He was filled with an uncommon happiness that morning. He demanded that Ignatius provide fresh pineapples for dessert that day, and perhaps some peaches. "For Eglantine, my dear daughter, returns from being finished in Switzerland this very day." Ignatius bowed and agreed to all his lordship's requests. Then the lordship noticed the sheets of handwritten music in his gardener's hands. "Ignatius, where did this come from?" Ignatius gasped, and then replied with an outright lie. "If you please, your lordship, I wrote it." His lordship raised an eyebrow, but scanned the music. "It's quite excellent, and for piano and in a suitable chord too." That was how the fuss began for Ignatius Crump. "Music, sweet music!" Eglantine had exclaimed on discovering those first few sheets of music. She had played the scribbled lines that very first day. Then the notion of Ignatius, a simple gardener, being able to write music captured his lordship's fancy. "Poor Ignatius is far too shy to play for himself, but my sweet Eglantine shall perform these unique works." This is how the fuss advanced itself. Ignatius was declared a genius, and his lordship took control of the newly discovered talent. Ignatius was given a new role, to write music, more of that great piano music. Ignatius took to the task. He hid the thrashing hand plant that wrote the music, and provided for its every care. It was still kept in the stove-house, but now it had been placed under the shelf of night-blooming orchids. The plant with its music-writing hand didn't seem to care. Every night the hand unfurled from the tight bud of leaves, and Ignatius was there to hand it a newly sharpened pencil and a ream of blank paper. Then first thing every morning, Ignatius went back to the stove-house and fetched the newly written music. In daylight the hand returned to the security of the tightly furled bud of bright green leaves. Eglantine didn't know what to make of Ignatius. He was red-haired and plain. She so wished him to have been more handsome. As she played his music, Eglantine fell in love with the composer. Ignatius' head had been turned. He enjoyed his growing fame as the greatest composer of his age. He could not let the secret out as to where the music really came from. "My dearest Ignatius, we are to give a recital for Her Majesty in London. I shall perform before our most important audience ever," Eglantine enthused as she grasped Ignatius Thump's fat hand to her bosom. "Oh, my sweet shy gardener, never to play your own divine music in public! To think that these hands can write such gracious lines!" Eglantine then dashed out of the room. Ignatius blushed. He stood staring after Eglantine. His lordship asked Ignatius to attend him. "Ignatius Crump, let me tell you this. Your music is making a great return of profit in the printed sheet music industry. Also, my dear daughter has become a renowned pianist with sole rights to play what you write. Now, if you please, she can only consider your hand in marriage if you build a vast fortune. Yes, you are from humble beginnings, but so was I. Write more music, build that fortune, then perhaps I'll have it no other way." Ignatius stepped over to his lordship's desk and took a cigar. Lighting it, and stared at his lordship. "You must write greater works, something huge to bring in the returns. Now your music has granted my daughter a royal performance, so build on that, Ignatius, build on that." For the royal performance in London, Eglantine had demanded several new dresses to appear in. She asked Ignatius to provide white orchids for her corsage. Ignatius didn't like leaving the northern estate for too long. He still remained in charge of the stovehouse. He took the under-gardener to one side and explained his instructions at great, pained length to him. "Take this key to my stovehouse. Open only in the morning and water all the orchids. Use tepid rainwater only. Lock the door behind you and retain the key at all times." London was a great success. The piano recital was given several encores. Eglantine took the deepest of curtsies when she was later introduced to His Majesty. "Ignatius Crump, I would like an original piece written for me," came the royal request. Eglantine, whose heart hadn't quite eclipsed her senses, had later that evening declined Ignatius' proposal of marriage. "Sweet Ignatius, you are but a gardener still. My hand will only be yours when a suitable fortune has been made." Under a large silvery moon, Ignatius walked along the new Thames embankment, clutching a white orchid that had fallen from Eglantine's corsage. His heart was heavy. Sweet Eglantine was as savvy as her father. Ignatius realized he needed a fortune in the bank. There and then he planned to get his miraculous writing hand plant to produce greater quantities of music. There would be great music written, and an equally great return of profits upon its sale as sheet music. Could he make more thrashing hand plants? It might be possible, if he could propagate the plant. How would he take a cutting? On returning to his lordship's great northern estate, Ignatius went for a stroll around the gardens. It was a fine autumnal night, and Ignatius sought out the under-gardener. He retrieved the key to the stovehouse from him. Ignatius took off his top hat and placed his cane at the door in the anteroom. He then unlocked the door leading to the stovehouse proper. The warm, highly perfumed air hit him. It was a familiar scent. Ignatius stepped into the room. The under-gardener had done a good job. All the orchids seemed to be in bright, almost luminous bloom. He bent down to examine his hand plant that was sitting under the bench. Ignatius gasped in horror. The under-gardener had done exactly as he'd been instructed. He'd watered the orchids in the stovehouse. However, he'd only watered the orchids. He had not watered the peculiar hand plant under the bench. Ignatius stood up, clutching the pot. There were tears in his eyes. The peculiar thrashing hand plant was dead. The poor thing had completely dried out, and it couldn't be revived. As the plant had withered, so too had Ignatius' chance of winning the hand of Eglantine in marriage.